Hey folks, welcome to another Triple T Thursday. For those just joining us, that's Tools, Tips, and Talk, where we'll discuss info for the knife maker. In today's episode, the 5 tips you need to do better forge welding. So what is forge welding? That's when you want to stick 2 pieces of steel together just by the heat and pressure from the forge and from either hammering or using a press or a power hammer. Why do you want that? Damascus is usually the number one reason people want to learn how to forge weld. Let's make sure you're successful. Step 1 to a good forge weld is prep work. Yep, that means before you even start, you need to prep your material. So first off, not all steels like to forge weld. There's certain steels like 5160 does not like to forge weld to itself. So be aware of what you're trying to forge weld to. Normally for Damascus, you're using 10 series like 1080, 1084, 1095, and 15N20. So most people will stick to those steels, or you're just trying to forge weld the same steel to itself for some other reason. So number one reason, you have to get those mating surfaces clean. That means grind them. The grit doesn't matter. It's how flat they are. You want those pieces to be flat together with no, holes or spaces in between. So getting them flat and as smooth as you can. Again, you don't need to go to 400 grit. You can use 36 grit is usually what I use, but you want them nice and flat and even. The next is keeping those together while you're forging involves some tack welds. So whether you're using a stick welder or a MIG welder, tack those together. When I do a billet, I try not to weld down the sides of a billet. I usually only do the corners because I don't want any of that mild steel weld in my billet. And I know if I put it on the corners of the billet, those are going to end up getting cut off anyway. So be careful and think about where you're going to put your weld. Step 2 is your forge. Of course, your forge has to get up to forge welding temperatures, number 1, and that's around 2200 degrees, 2200 degrees. But one of the important things that people don't think about is the mixture of air and gas in your forge and how rich a mixture is, meaning how much gas. If it's gas heavy, it's a very rich mixture. If it's an oxidizing flame, it's got a lot of oxygen in it, very blue flame. You don't want a really high oxidizing flame for forge welding. You're introducing oxygen into the mix there. And this is one of the reasons why I actually don't like these Venturi burners that don't let you control the airflow. The Frosty T design is one that I don't particularly like unless you really do put those flaps on the side to control the air intake. Because if you can't control the air, you're just running it full blast, full oxidizing flame, and that's not good. You'll notice that, when you look at my forge, which I'll put up here, I have a forced air forge, meaning I have a blower and I can control the amount of air going into the forge, and I can also control the amount of gas. So I can control those separately so that I can fully control, do I have a reducing flame, meaning a lot of gas, or do I have an oxidizing flame where I've got a lot of oxygen coming out? And you can usually tell this by, if there's a lot of flames coming out the front, that means the gas there's so much gas that it's burning outside of the forge. If you've got a really, really blue flame and all of the flame is inside the forge, you probably have a very little gas and a lot of oxygen. Creates really hot flame, but again, you're introducing oxygen, which is going to produce scale. And scale is the enemy of forge welding. Another thing to note, don't remove your billet from the forge once it's in there for any reason unless you're going to set the weld. Every time you remove that billet from the forge, the forge should be a very low oxygen environment because it's very hot, you're burning gas in there. When you remove it from the forge, it's just going to scale immediately. So you don't want to remove it because you don't want scale. Again, scale is the enemy. Let's talk about step 3. So step 3 is flux, and I gave it its own step because it just warrants a lot of discussion. So some people are anti-flux, and some people think flux is the best thing ever. I think I'm kind of in the middle. Flux is a necessary thing at times, and it's a good thing because it will help you remove scale from your steel. It eats away scale. Now, it does have some other bad properties. Of course, it eats away your forge, and it has a lot of other aspects that are not so fun. You'll be relining your forge if you use too much of it. It's not a badge of honor to be able to forge weld without flux. Okay, some people have this image in their head that, oh, so-and-so forge welds without flux, I should be able to do it too. Well, if you look back at step 2, they probably have a forge that they can adjust everything and adjust the air perfectly. You may not have that. So flux is a good thing, so don't shy away from it. But I only use flux when I'm forge welding. I only use it when I'm setting the weld. Once the weld is set, no more flux. Okay? Only while you're setting the weld, and only if you think you're going to have some seams or something where air could get in and you want to prevent some scale. So my typical method is to heat up the billet until it's red, a dull red, and then I will take it out and I will flux it. And for flux, we typically use borax, this 20 mule team borax. You can also buy special borax or special flux from blacksmith supply shops that it doesn't have moisture in it, so it doesn't flake off as soon as you put it in there. Step 4, heat. So you gotta have enough heat to do forge welding. If you're just going based on color, it should be a bright yellow, almost white color when your steel is hot enough. If you're using flux, when you pull it out, it should smoke. You'll know exactly what I mean when you see it. The flux will literally smoke off of the billet, and then you'll know you're at forge welding temps. The number one issue with bad forge welds is usually lack of heat. Not getting the billet hot enough, pulling it out, trying to set the weld, forming scale, and then trying to repeat this process. Even if you do bring it up to heat at that point, you've already created that scale, which is going to prevent those pieces from sticking. So make sure it's hot enough on the first go. So you don't build up scale. You don't want to be taking that billet out of the forge without it being hot enough. Just for some reference, my usual billet is 4 inches. It's 1.5 inch stock by 1/8 inch, and it's usually about a 3.5 inch tall billet. So, a good sized billet. I let that soak for at least 15 minutes, sometimes 20, because even though the outside might look like it's hot, you need the core of that to be hot, or you'll just get some superficial welds on the outside, and you don't want that. I'll also turn it every 5 minutes or so, just so that I know it's not all heating on one side and not the other. So I'll kind of move it around in the forge, or I'll rotate it a bit, and that'll help you as well. Now we're on to number 5, setting the weld. So if you're using just a hammer, you want to take it out and be very systematic about how you're hitting it, either from the outside in or from one side to the other. Don't just randomly tap it on the billet. Be very systematic about where you're hitting it and how you're hitting it. And I would suggest you hit it with the flat side of your hammer. You don't want to be spreading steel. You're just doing light taps to tack it together. And if it's at the right temperature, it's going to stick together. You just need to give it a little bit of help and some taps along the way. You're not trying to move metal at this point. If you have a hydraulic press, this is where you're going to put it in the press and give it a press on the whole surface, okay, in one shot. That's the best way to set a forge weld, is really just press down on everything and make sure it gets one good weld. In this heat, don't try to stretch out the metal. Don't do anything. Just do a light press and then back in the forge. On the hydraulic press, I will do 3 full heats of just pressing before I know when I do anything. That's me setting the welds. 3 heats, 3 presses. If you're using a hammer, that's probably going to be twice that of setting those welds and making sure they're good. So each time after setting the weld, whether with a press or a hammer, you need to clean the billet. And what I do is I have two brushes. I have a really coarse brush and I have a fine brush. And I will take the scale off with the coarse brush, and then especially if I'm doing Damascus between like thinner layers, I will take the fine brush and make sure there's no scale between those layers. And then I'll reflux it and back in the forge. So how do you know when you're done? The easiest way is color. When you take it out and it's one color, it's all the same color, you visibly cannot tell the difference in color between the layers, it's probably forge welded. If you see the layers and you see a delineation between the layers in color, it's not forge welded. So keep going or reconsider what you're doing. You need to get them all the same color. The other thing is it should feel solid. You should be able to take it to the anvil and hit it, and it should feel like a big chunk of metal, not a bunch of layers that you're hitting. Like, it should feel solid. Only at this point when on a hydraulic press, when I'm done 3 heats, will then I start lightly doing it on its edge, just to usually to even out the edge. But that also tells me if the welds are set. I'll press it a little bit on the edge, then flip it up and hit the tops again, just so I know, yeah, it's set. I hope this video on forge welding helped you out. Go make some cool Damascus, send me some pictures, and I'll see you on the next one.